Welcome to our second faculty development workshop in collaboration with the Learning House, who we have partnered with to expand our distance education initiative. As you continue with your course development efforts, both online and on ground, we must be mindful of different teaching philosophies. Today, I have invited TLH Director of Professional Development, Galen Davis, to speak on the topic of andragogy, which is the theory and practice of teaching adult learners. In the interest of time, I'll turn it over to Galen to begin today's presentation.
Great, thanks, Donnie. I'm delighted to speak to you today, and Donnie's done a great job of introducing the topic, so I'll just move right along. This is not essential. It's just a sign-in form for anyone who's present. We'd like to track who's there, but we also tend to send out satisfaction forms, and this will help me send those directly as needed. It's not clickable in your browser, but if you have the tear sheet, it's also in there. So again, not crucial. But Donna, you can always hand me a list of names and email addresses if you need to, and if you want the satisfaction form to go to them. So that's me. You may have seen my video earlier. I no longer have the chops. I don't know why I chose to do my company photo at that time. But anyway, yeah, I'm the Director of Faculty Development and Video Production at the Learning House. Two very different teams that do very different things, but it keeps things lively. Prior to this, I worked for a small startup in Pittsburgh, based out of Carnegie Mellon that built its own learning management system from the ground up. We combined that with consulting services, which I was a part of in the pedagogical area. And prior to that, I worked at Stanford University for about 8.5 years, helping faculty use technology in their teaching and thinking through their learning objectives and pedagogical goals. So today we're going to be talking about andragogy, and my hope is that by the end of this session, you'll be able to define andragogy. You probably have a definitional basis of it, but more than that, to articulate how the Universal Design for Learning framework, the instructional design framework, is actually a pretty effective instructional design framework for mixed age students, and particularly adult learners. Hopefully you'll be able to identify characteristics of an adult-focused teaching methodology, and lastly, to be able to utilize andragogy-based teaching strategies in your particular online classroom. Now, I do have this poll, that's the reason why I wanted to share my screen instead, but if there's only one or two folks there, it may not be worth trying to make this work. We still have pretty low attendance, Donnie?
Yeah, we have one participant at the time.
Okay, no worries, we'll just move on, because we just move on to the actual data. So let's start by defining, and identifying the adult learner. And we'll start with sort of a definition of andragogy. Now, as Donnie kind of already said, andragogy refers to theories and practices as they relate to adult education. And the theory itself, which was developed about 45 years ago, it's kind of established in contradistinction to pedagogy. As you could probably tell by the end of the word, the goji part of it, it's a Greek word. So andragogy technically means leader of man, and pedagogy means leader of children. So again, it's in sort of contradistinction to pedagogy. Pedagogy is often used for, the theory of teaching, or teaching in, the sort of instructional theories. But in this context, it's often referred to as a sort of K through 12 approach. So andragogy itself focuses on particular common characteristics of adult learners. Namely that they're, self-directed and purpose-oriented and internally motivated and so on. I'll discuss these a little bit more in depth in a few slides. Now, just I don't have a ton of data from SAU at present, since our relationship is still pretty new. But just for a sense of perspective, the average age of an SAU online student is actually 31 years old. So I find that to be a little interesting. The oldest is 55. Whereas the youngest student is, as you might imagine, 18. And for those who are interested, here's a table, and it compares SAU's age data to nationwide averages. The nationwide average data was taken from our online college students report. Every year, Learning House releases this report. It's based on interviews with, or not interviews, surveys of maybe 1,500 to 2,000 students who answer a number of questions. Some of them are demographic, so we're able to gather information about, at least the age range. So you can see here from the table that the sort of college age online students, the 18 to 24 range at SAU, at least, they account for only maybe just over a quarter of all online students. So chances are you have a good number of adult learners in your course. So hopefully, talking about some of these tips and the characteristics of these adult learners will help you in your online courses as you move forward. According to Malcolm Knowles, who's kind of the father of the theory of andragogy, there are sort of 6 key characteristics of adult learners. The first is that adult learners tend to be more self-directed, and generally speaking, as people mature, their self-perception moves from being a sort of dependent personality towards that of a more self-directed human being, right? I mean, this is kind of a necessary stage of becoming an adult, right? And adults tend to view education more so than young students as a lifelong process. And so it kind of makes them easy to be able to function in a self-directed environment. And in fact, that's the main challenge for many younger online learners, is the necessity to sort of manage your entire schedule. Residential education, face-to-face education, when students are in college, I mean, that's a sort of structured environment where they are a quote-unquote student, that is their role. And the structure sort of gives them much more of a sense of where they need to be at what particular time. But when it's online, it's a little bit more challenging. So adult learners tend to have a better sense of how to manage their schedules. And adults also tend to have a better metacognitive perspective in that they have a better awareness of their learning preferences than younger students. And they've interacted with people throughout their lives. They've had more feedback than younger learners, and so they have more skills and sort of self-awareness in this realm. Adult learners also have a larger reservoir of experience, and it kind of makes them a resource for their own learning. Really, they're not as dependent on the expertise of the facilitator or other people to really inform their learning goals. So, and the advantage of this is that their experience, the experience of these older learners, can enrich their own learning, but maybe more importantly, it can enrich the learning of the younger students in the course if you allow them to interact with each other in meaningful ways. Adult learners also tend to be more ready to learn than younger learners, and this readiness is very closely related to the developmental tasks of their social roles. And like I was saying earlier, this makes sense because a lot of younger students are sort of filling an expected role of student, due to their age. Right? If they were to fill out a form that said, "What's your job?" they'd put student on there, whereas your adult learner probably put something else, like put their job in there or something like that. Now, older learners are in school for a variety of reasons, and generally have extrinsic factors in their lives that kind of urges their motivation to learn. Now, that said, despite these extrinsic factors, older learners tend to have more intrinsic motivation. Now, obviously, as you get older, your perspectives on various things change. And, often our perception on learning evolves as we get older from one of potential future application of what you're learning, the knowledge you're acquiring, to more about the immediate application of that knowledge, right? So as a result, adults tend to be more problem-centered than subject-centered in learning. And I should say that, this kind of motivation, intrinsic motivation, can often be the most powerful when it comes to learning. As a side note here, I do a workshop on motivation. In fact, I'm doing one next week, I believe, and it's available to everybody. So hopefully you guys everyone got that information. But motivation essentially breaks down to 2 main components: value and expectancy. Value is the worth that a student places in the course materials and what they're learning, and expectancy is the perception that they're able to succeed. Due to the fairness of the learning environment, due to their preparedness and ability to access the materials and so on, and those 2 things, value and expectancy, continue to break down. But when it comes to value, there's 3 different types: attainment, intrinsic, and instrumental. Attainment value is about achieving greater levels of skill. Instrumental value, if you complete something, it's going to help enable you to get to something else, right? It helps you achieve another goal. And intrinsic value is about doing something that's inherently pleasurable, right? And what I say in that workshop a lot of time is that intrinsic value is oftentimes the most difficult kind of value to foster, since this really has to do with the personality of the student. So in a lot of ways, it's nice to have adult learners in your class because they're more intrinsically motivated to learn, rather than those younger students who, again, are often filling a sort of societal role, of student. That's not to say that they don't have any intrinsic motivation to learn. It's just we see it more in adult learners. Adult learners, like I mentioned earlier, tend to be more focused on problems. They like to work backwards to find solutions. Younger learners tend to learn skills sequentially and also apply them sequentially. But older learners can leverage their experience to find, ways to apply this kind of experience and knowledge that they already have to the problems at hand. And lastly, adults tend to be more focused on why they need to learn something, right? So they're asking themselves questions like, how does this relate to my current or future career? How does this course fit into my life experience? How can I apply this, what I'm learning now to my life right now? And generally speaking, all students benefit from, understanding the application of material to the real world, certainly. But, the adult learner in particular needs that sense of immediate application of theory to practice and to focus on problem solving. So there needs to be less attention given to theory and more to the sort of practical application of those theories. So my next slide is a poll slide. We'll just move on. I was just getting a sort of gauging whether you guys feel the same way, that adult learners are more engaged than younger learners. So as I mentioned earlier, older learners are in school or doing online education for a variety of reasons, and they range from personal reasons to life-related reasons to career-specific reasons. It might be unemployment or career change, or an attempt to get a promotion by expanding their skill set or getting some sort of certificate or something. Maybe they just want to enhance their skill set, or maybe their boss or their company has asked them to increase or improve their skills in some way. And what this kind of gets at is that one way to sort of describe some or most of these characteristics that we talked about in the previous slide is to say that adult learners are very goal-oriented, right? So here's more data from the 2017 Online College Students Report that asked the prospective students, about their primary motivation for enrolling in the most recent online program. And you'll see that the top reason for entering online education, at least in our data set, was to transition to a new career field, right? And when it comes down to it, almost 80% of online college students cite a career-focused reason as their primary motivator for enrolling in the program. So that's interesting. So what you're seeing is a lot of older learners who are motivated by or compelled by sort of job needs to go back to school, to get more education, to get a certificate, to get a degree, that kind of thing. So before I start diving into more specific tips for teaching older learners, I want to take a look at UDL, which is a Universal Design for Learning. This is an instructional design framework. So what is it? Well, like I said, it's an instructional design framework, and it's based in cognitive neuroscience. It's actually pretty interesting. And essentially what it does is it acknowledges that every student that comes into your classroom has a preset preference for how he or she learns, right? And moreover, each of these preferences is not necessarily binary, right? It's not one or the other, or yes or no, but they kind of exist along a spectrum. And UDL, the research in UDL suggests that many courses are targeted towards this average student, this middle line, drawn down these, and the idea being that instructors tend to design for that average student, that doesn't exist really, because when it comes down to it, all the students that you have are at different points along that spectrum. So no student is average. In fact, there's actually a really interesting TED Talk that's out there. I think it's actually called The Myth of the Average Student. And it's basically a story about the Air Force, and they were trying to get a better crop of pilots into their program. And so they did more rigorous recruiting, and they got what they thought was a better batch of potential pilots. And when they put them in the cockpit and had them start flying, they were actually worse. And what they found out was that a lot of them had trouble reaching the controls, or various controls. And they found that it was because the cockpit, the seat in the cockpit, had been designed for an average person, an average height, average weight. And they did something like this. They made all these spectra of various measurements in the body, like knee to ankle and ankle to toe, and like all these various sub measurements of the body. And they found that no one was average. No one sort of ended up being right down the middle. And so they went to the Lockheed Martin and the various other manufacturers, and they were like, you got to change this. And so in the end, those companies started manufacturing cockpits that had minutely adjustable seats in many ways. And obviously that's pretty important when you're flying at Mach 2, that you got to be able to reach the controls pretty easily. But anyway, like the idea is that in UDL is you're supposed to design for the margins, right? You design for these edge cases, and that by doing so, you essentially design for all learning preferences that are involved. Now, these learning preferences that exist and these are just a sample, by the way. This isn't, this isn't like a definitive list of learning preferences. It's a random sample. But these learning preferences arise for a variety of different reasons, right? Some students have specific disabilities that result in an inability to essentially perceive information when it's presented in a certain way, right? So a visually impaired student might struggle with print materials, or a student with a learning disability might have difficulty processing information when it's presented in large blocks of text, or which leads them to have a preference for graphics-based information because it's easier for them to absorb the information when it's presented that way. Cultural differences also impact how a student prefers to learn. Some examples, in some cultures, it's actually insulting to the professor to provide a citation, since it would be expected that the professor would know all of the relevant research. In many cultures, students collaborate regularly on projects, and even if it's against the rules, collaboration is often considered a trivial violation of them. It doesn't, it's not a egregious violation of academic integrity. I think in Chinese culture, age confers respect. So if you're asked for help by someone who's older than you, there's a sort of social pressure that may trump any concerns about academic integrity, to not cheat if someone's asking you for help who's older. Preferred methods of communication also influence learning preferences. So, for example, if a student prefers to communicate verbally, they might develop a preference for, say, making videos or audio podcasts or something rather than writing, right? And in post-secondary education, it's also common for past educational experiences or job experiences or just life experience in general to impact students' learning preferences. And this is definitely the case, as we've already seen with adult learners. And I think, as one of the recommended readings for this session, there was an article I suggested about learning styles, and it might seem like I'm about to dive into that. UDL is not really about individual learning preferences or trying to tailor your teaching methodology to the various learning preferences in your, of your students, assuming that you could even ascertain them. UDL is a little different because it essentially works on the idea that instructors can predict these differences that exist in student learning styles, and you can actually plan ahead of time in order for learning to occur, as efficiently as possible for everyone by designing for these margins. Now, in this sense, UDL goes beyond accessibility, and the unfortunate thing is that UDL is often considered in terms of accessibility, and they are similar, right? They both focus on ensuring that content's presented in a way that can be perceived by your students, but there are some very specific differences, right? So first, accessibility is generally concerned with adherence to the law. And most often, accessibility is most frequently related to the ADA, the Access with Disabilities Act. And for that reason, accessibility tends to focus pretty specifically on the needs of disabled students. UDL is different, right? UDL is a framework for the construction of a flexible learning environment. And it addresses the needs of the disabled student, true, but it also focuses on the learning differences and needs of all students. So UDL isn't necessarily concerned with any one learning style or preference. It's concerned with strategies that promote effective learning for all styles. Now, UDL, the research in UDL has identified 3 brain networks, they call them networks, and 3 accompanying course design principles that accompany them. So there's the recognition network, and its focus is the ability to recognize content. This is the area that tells the rest of the body what it's seeing and works to interpret it in meaningful ways. And the principle that comes out of this network from the UDL framework is about providing multiple means of representation of instructional materials, that is, adding equivalent alternatives for instructional materials. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. The next network is called the strategic network. It's about developing skills based on the information that's presented to the student or to the person. And this part of the brain also works to develop particular strategies that work with content that's repeatedly encountered. So This is one reason that learners develop specific learning preferences when presented with content again and again. So this network essentially develops separate roadmaps for what to do when faced with different types of content. So for example, when written words are encountered by a particular person, and when flowcharts are encountered by that person, the strategy associated with flowcharts, if the student succeeds or gets a good grade or a better grade by making a flowchart rather than writing, that person's brain, at least the strategic network, develops a preference associated with flowcharts because it worked for them in the past, right? And the principle related to this network is to provide multiple means of action and expression when you're creating your assignments. And the last network is called the affective network, and it's associated with caring and prioritizing tasks. And this part of the brain is related to why a person is motivated to act in a certain way. And it's about motivation, right? And the principle associated with this is to identify engagement methods in your course based on learning preferences and motivation. So this is the foundation of UDL that helps us identify some tips for teaching adult learners. So again, the UDL framework is great, and it's great for all levels of instructional design, but it is particularly helpful for adult learners, I'll say in particular. I should also mention that there's another separate workshop entirely that focuses on this framework and its recommendations. The UDL framework is a little bit overwhelming when you look at the various tips that they have. I think there's something like 39 recommendations that come out of this, which is a pretty huge checklist to have in mind when you're designing an online course. But the idea behind it is that, like I said, you can address all learning styles and preferences through some changes to your course design methodology. And what I'm trying to get at here is that many of these definitely apply to andragogy, to an approach to reaching adult learners. So we've got this foundation about adult learners and who they are and what they what their preferences, what their characteristics are, and the utility of the UDL framework. So I want to move on to some course design and delivery strategies that you can engage in to ensure that you're addressing the learning preferences of both your older learners as well as your younger learners. Because what you don't want to do is to have to devise multiple methodologies to reach various ages, various learning preferences, and so on. So when it comes to your instructional material, the first tip I would have is to add equivalent options. I mentioned this earlier, and by equivalent option, I'm talking about a piece of instruction, two pieces of instructional material that give students the same amount of skills or knowledge when they consume them. They're equivalent, right? So, itching my head here. I know it makes a large noise on the mic, this is largely based on UDL. You take sort of based on a UDL principle, but it's also about addressing a wide variety of learning preferences. The more options that you can provide for your instructional materials, generally speaking, the more you can rest assured that you're addressing as many learning preferences as possible. Like I said earlier, older learners generally understand better than younger learners what works well for them. They have that better metacognitive perspective on their learning styles and learning preferences, right? Now, I mean, if you think about this, sort of practically speaking, adding equivalent options, I know this seems kind of overwhelming, right? So that's why, generally speaking, we recommend that you focus on adding equivalent options on course enhancement, right? So not the first time that you offer your course. It's obviously a lot of work to create, say a video in addition to a reading, right? But the idea is once you've taught the course a couple of times, you've probably got a more solid understanding of where the pain points in your course are for the students, where they struggle with material. If there's, if you've consistently seen low scores on an exam, you might want to look at the instructional materials that prepare them for that assessment, and maybe considering offering equivalent options, or adding images, or offering a video or creating a video. Again, that's an equivalent alternative, so students can either read the article or watch the video, or if they want, they can do both, right? Anyway, that the course enhancement period definitely gives you a sense of where to target your efforts first there. So if you're designing a course for the first time, I wouldn't recommend going nuts here and just adding tons of equivalent options. The next recommendation I would have is sort of it's actually a general course design principle, but it's particularly important for adult learners. Provide context for all of your instructional materials. Context is king here. Now, and it's from a sort of practical perspective, what I'm talking about is essentially using the description fields in the LMS to your advantage, right? And I really do mean for all of the material, for every single reading, for every single case study, whatever it is, you need to provide context for that piece of instructional material in order for students to be able to fully learn it. Now, in some ways, this is compensating for what we call expert blind spot. You may have heard of this term, I'm not sure, but the idea is that you, the faculty member, you're the expert and you understand how all the pieces in the course fit together, right? You've got the big picture. Students don't, right? They're novices, and especially younger learners don't necessarily understand why they're consuming a particular piece of instructional material. I mean, they'll follow your instructions, they'll do it, but they don't know why they're doing it necessarily. So with this in mind, try to ensure that your course has a logical structure that students can observe, and your module titles can play a big role here. When it comes, I think we may have talked about this in our course mapping session last time, but your module titles can be really important in creating that sense of a logical narrative in your course. Students need to be able to sort of scan the course in the LMS and to figure out the progression, the narrative thread throughout your course. And you want to do things like create a parallel structure with your module titles. So if you start them with a verb, you start the first one with a verb, try to make the rest start with a verb. If if you start the first one with a question, make the rest of your module titles pose a question. Start with a gerund, make them all start with gerunds. Just a parallel structure can go a long way. Try to keep them short too, for what it's worth, so they can maybe fit on 1 or 2 lines in the LMS. Again, you want to be able to have students scan the LMS and be able to pick up the narrative thread. Module introductions can be very valuable here too, especially videos. They can be very helpful to highlight that narrative thread in your course, and and they can also enhance the sense of instructor presence in the course if you're recording videos, that establish you as a sort of expert in the course and someone who's very involved and enthusiastic and engaged, right? And I just wanted to share this mantra that we have at Learning House, which is review, preview, motivate, right? And this is all about providing context, right? Review, preview, motivate. By review, I'm talking about taking time to connect the material in question to what your students have previously learned. And this is, in the language of the science of learning, this is about activating prior knowledge, right? How does this connect to what they've already learned? How does it build on what they've already learned? Preview is about describing what they're about to consume, and more importantly, perhaps giving them tips or guidance in terms of what they're about to consume, like what to look out for. There's a study that shows that students who were told to pay attention to what to pay attention to in a particular reading assignment retained the information better. So you're essentially priming the pump. So if it's worth your time to say something like, pay particular attention to the author's argument on feminism on pages 82 to 84, something like that. That's valuable to students. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly for your adult learners, motivate, right? Tell students why they should care, why they should be doing this, consuming this piece of instructional material. Does what they're learning have some sort of real world application? Is it crucial for understanding some future topic that you're going to get to in the course? As I mentioned earlier, older students in particular are very obsessed with the relevance of what they're consuming to their everyday life, their life right now. And the idea behind all of this, the review, preview, motivate piece, is that you can't necessarily expect your students to connect all the dots on their own. By underscoring this context of everything in your course, you're providing essentially a schema, some sort of framework into which their brains can insert the information that they're learning. It provides a sort of skeletal structure, and you're adding the muscles. That's kind of a grisly metaphor, but hopefully you get what I'm getting at. Particularly if you're in a theory-heavy discipline, do your best to connect theory to practice, right? So, like we mentioned, older learners, they like to solve problems and they're concerned with relevance. So you should be trying to demonstrate how the course theories and concepts are utilized, or how they apply to scenarios that occur, in the marketplace, in the workforce, daily life, whatever, some sort of real-world application of what they're learning. Back when I worked at that startup in Pittsburgh, I worked closely with a Carnegie Mellon professor who was teaching a statistical thermodynamics course, and I'm a humanities guy, so this was like totally Greek to me. I don't understand anything of what he was talking about. But with that in mind, what we tried to convince him of, and I should mention that he was filming a bunch of videos, and those videos were full of equations and how to solve the equations and how to memorize the equations. But we convinced him at the beginning of every module to film what we called a hook, where he would essentially illustrate the application of the theories in question. Again, these are statistical thermodynamics. I didn't get it, but these things made sense to me. So for instance, we filmed him in the kitchenette of our startup space, and he was like, so water has very special properties. Why does ice float on water? And we had him drop ice into water and then it floated. And he's like, whereas when I drop these like small pebbles into the water, they just sink to the bottom. Well, it's a special property of water that we're going to talk about, in this course. And there was another one where he like had a wall walker, those like sticky things that look like sort of mini octopuses or octopi, and you throw it against the wall and it kind of climbs down the wall because it's really sticky. And that was so he was talking about the surface properties of that particular material. So those brought the material to life. Again, I couldn't tell you what he was talking about when it came to the equations or anything like that, but those hooks helped connect the theory to practice. And I felt like that was very valuable. He was actually developing the material both for a course as well as a MOOC. So that probably helped his older learners who were taking the MOOC at least, create some sort of sense of relevance. Now this one might go without saying at SAU, but just in case, don't require any synchronous sessions in your course. And for older learners in particular, they've chosen online ed because they can fit it in with their busy lives. Many of them have jobs or families or, a variety of responsibilities that keep them pretty busy. So, entirely separate from the logistical challenge of holding synchronous sessions, because you're dealing with multiple time zones or, variable schedules and so on, requiring synchronous sessions can really alienate your older learners and may result in, fundamentally an attrition in your course. In a similar vein, try to keep the workload from module to module pretty consistent. Older learners in particular benefit from understanding what their weekly commitment to the course is, so they can schedule their life accordingly. So try not to make it so there's 1 week, 3 weeks of 3 hours of work a week and then suddenly it's 10. Try to keep the module sizes relatively consistent. And there are calculators online that you can use to estimate how long it takes to read something. And again, this is for an average person, so you'll have to do your best. But these might assist you in trying to, make a rough estimate of the amount of workload involved. And for what it's worth, it may also help you confirm or calculate your credit hours too. Now let's talk about assessments. What strategies can you engage in designing your assessments that will benefit your older learners? Well, again, this is another general course design principle, but it's particularly beneficial for your older learners. Include a required icebreaker activity at the beginning of the course, which could just be like a discussion board or something, where you ask students to introduce themselves. Basically, as the instructor, you got to try to get a handle on who your students are and why they're taking the course. Because ultimately, the more that you know about your students, the more that you, as the instructor, can tailor your instructional materials and assessments, or at the very least, if you're just the facilitator, your responses on the discussion boards and your feedback on the assignments, you can tailor that stuff to their areas of interest, which raises their motivation, right, and raises their sense of value in the course. So again, it's an icebreaker activity, so you can ask questions like, where are you located? How old are you? If you're a working professional, what do you do? Why are you taking the course? Have you served in the military? And so on. These kind of questions can give you answers that really help you understand your students' motivations and help you help them to make connections between your course and their lives. And related back to the UDL framework, this is related to the affective network. But understanding the why of your older students, once you start running the course, can really meaningfully inform your responses on the discussion forums as you interact with your students. Another best practice in the spirit of andragogy is to provide or include a prior knowledge assessment, or prior learning assessment, depending on how you like to call it. Perhaps alongside the icebreaker activity, sort of a required no stakes or low stakes activity at the beginning of the course. A prior knowledge assessment is basically a tool to help you as the instructor gauge bias, gauge, misunderstanding, common misunderstandings in the course, the students' preparedness, and both on an individual level for individual students in your course, as well as sort of more generally. So you might find out interesting stuff, like maybe if there's a prereq for your course, maybe that professor isn't doing such a good job because the students aren't coming in with the knowledge they're supposed to know. But it generally just helps you adjust things on the fly. But for older learners who tend to have a wider variety of experience and background, you might learn that they're maybe sometimes over prepared, and then include supplemental materials as needed, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Also, be flexible in your assignments as well as your rubrics. Try to focus on the skills that you're assessing rather than the medium it needs to be in, right? So unless it's necessary, and oftentimes it is necessary, try to avoid using language that's specific to a certain type of deliverable, because ultimately that means that you're not going to have to change your rubrics every time you add an option for an assessment activity to the course. What this kind of boils down to is kind of paying attention to the verbs that you use in your assignment descriptions and your rubrics. So, for example, when you use the word write, write a 5-page paper or something like that, you're already limiting the student's options. So ask yourself, can the students accomplish your learning objective by submitting a video instead of a paper, or writing a play even, or designing an infographic or something like that? Again, older learners are bringing this wide range of experience to your course, and may have found really powerful ways to express themselves, which the younger students may not have developed yet as a skill set. So obviously you can't always do this. Students need to write sometimes, or maybe most of the time, but when you can, try to be flexible, and your older students are really going to benefit from that flexibility, and your younger students too. You also need to set really clear standards of decorum in your course. This creates, so obviously a safe space for students to participate, particularly in the online forums. And most of you probably know this as netiquette, and just setting rules for sort of civil discourse in the discussion forums. Some of you may have heard of Godwins Law. This guy Godwin is the director of innovation policy and general counsel of the R Street Institute. Basically, the Godwin's Law is, as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Hitler approaches 1. Right now, you probably don't have to worry about quite this much. It's more about more anonymous online forums when this is an issue. But the important thing is that older students might feel sometimes awkward interacting with their younger peers, particularly if they're in the minority. So try to ensure that discussions are going to stay civil, stay evidence-based, because that's crucial for building community in the course, irrespective of age. Try to aim for authenticity in your assessments as well. Now, when we talk about authentic assessment, this is when you ask students to perform real-world tasks, or tasks with some sort of extracurricular impact. So, when you're thinking about your assignments, ask yourself, what are some of the tasks that professionals in your field perform, right? So could the students, write a real grant proposal? Could they design a database for some sort of nonprofit, local nonprofit? Maybe they could compose a letter to a policymaker, and if you can't think of ways to fold in sort of authentic assessment, are there ways to get feedback from experts or professionals in your field? In a basic sense, students benefit enormously from hearing how experts think and respond, particularly in your field, if your field is something that they're interested in. And using authentic assessment can enhance students' motivation, because it basically underscores the real-world value of what you're teaching. And obviously, this is particularly the case when it comes to andragogy. So as we talked about earlier, given that most adult learners no longer really self-identify as quote-unquote student as their primary identity, they might identify themselves as father or business person or whatever, they're often more focused on the relevance of the material to their own lives and their job and the real world, right? And an authentic approach is very student-centered, especially when considering the older learners in your course. These assessments can be used for motivation and for feedback that you will aid your students in, assessing or correcting their learning goals as they relate to their actual lives. Also, do what you can to leverage students' environments and experiences in your online course. So as I mentioned before, these adult learners are bringing with them a ton of experience and background with them. So, you could have maybe there's a civil engineering course where students are asked to create a video on local sort of infrastructural issues or social issues or something, or an anthropology course that asks students to map their own neighborhoods and identify areas of cultural significance. I mean, here you're basically taking advantage of the diverse demographics of the online classroom in multiple ways. You're taking advantage of their diverse geography and their diverse age. And research indicates that people attach more meaning to learning that they gain from experience than those they acquire passively, right? So sending them out into the community or finding something local to talk about can be very valuable. And working professionals have an opportunity to leverage their professional experience, which can enhance their motivation and establish the relevance of the material to their daily lives. And for what it's worth, this might provide networking opportunities for the younger students too. Try to consider incorporating collaboration into your course too, like group assignments or something like that. This can obviously build community and enhance the connections between the students, which is a very valuable exercise. But again, you're leveraging the life experience, both personal and professional, of the older learners to enrich the learning experience of the younger learners. And according to this research that I was talking about earlier, the adult learner should be given a climate for collaborative learning where the instructor provides tone of mutual learning, opportunities for students to learn from one another, or collaborative peer learning, if you want to call it that, opportunities to meaningfully engage with the course material, and engaging assignments that connect theory and practice, right? And these are good goals to have or effectively performed in group work. So you can consider a problem-based approach where students need to identify what they need to know and teach each other. And it's great for adult learners since, as we discussed, they tend to have a problem-based approach themselves, working backwards to find solutions and working through the information that they have at hand to identify what they need to learn themselves. They're very self-directed. Just a caveat, case-based learning is fantastic, but but it brings with it its own complexity. So just be aware that it could be a Pandora's box if you start getting into this. This is most applicable, or at least sort of easily applicable, in sort of a nursing setting, where they have a case about a patient and the students work in groups to collect relevant information and develop a treatment plan. Another idea for collaboration, if there's a German language course, students use Twitter to collaboratively compose a short story. This is a way to put your older learners in touch with your younger students and to allow the older learners to enrich the younger learners' experience. Now, during course delivery, what kind of tips do we have for facilitators? Well, one thing that you can do to ensure that you're reaching all of your learners, regardless of age, is to practice instructor presence. Now, in some ways, this should go without saying when it comes to an online course. It's essential to create instructor presence. But the idea is to ensure that you demonstrate your eagerness to stay involved and help guide your students. Now, as I mentioned before, module introductions, great way to do this. But during delivery, be sure to provide feedback that's based on best practices. And we have an article on our Center for Teaching and Learning website on best practices when it comes to feedback. So feel free to hunt that down. And also be sure to participate actively on the discussion forums, during course delivery. Similarly, there are a number of best practices surrounding this, also on the CTL, but the idea is to kind of have the Goldilocks approach, quote unquote, just the right amount of involvement. So you want to push students who provide sort of incomplete or unsubstantiated arguments. That's where you get involved. When you do respond, try to use students' first names and try to leverage what you've learned about them individually in your responses, and do your best, obviously, to keep discussions on track and, of course, civil, though hopefully you won't have to do that because you've already established the netiquette policy. Also, be sure to leverage your LMS's announcements feature. You want to communicate frequently with your students, as needed, of course, not just spam them. So consider doing video announcements, because that's another great way to build instructor presence, and try to ensure that your announcements are specific to this course or this group of students, right? So not just alerts on upcoming deadlines or something like that, but maybe a response to their collective performance on the last exam, or where you saw common pain points or common mistakes made or something like that. That can build presence in your course. Also, like I mentioned very briefly earlier, adopt a tone of mutual learning when you can. So while practicing instructor presence is about positing yourself as an expert, it's also important to create an environment where you express eagerness or willingness, at least, to learn from the students as well. That it's a two-way street. It's a bilateral exchange, and it's possible that some of your older learners are as old as you are or older, right? So it's very much the case that you could learn something from these older students. So for example, an application of your course material to their particular professional field or background, that could be scintillating. Also, don't be afraid to include supplemental materials in your course. That's to say, materials that aren't required in the course. Just make sure that they're labeled as such, or included in a cafe style forum or something like that. That's not part of the required course materials. But depending on what you learn about them in the icebreaker activity or in the prior knowledge assessment, you might be able to provide supplemental materials that are specifically related to this, to the interests of your students that you learn about. So this is, one way that icebreaker and the prior knowledge assessment might benefit you. Now, I did have a discussion slide here. There's only a few of us in here, but I was just, Donnie or other audience members, are there any strategies that you guys have found effective in dealing with adult learners in your online courses?
I use your announcements in the last slide you had. You're talking about instructor presence. The announcements I use I use it in all 8. Our courses are all 8 weeks, but at the announcements section is where I use why is this week's series of problems important to your progress in the class, important to your job, important to possible career advancement, and do that on a Monday morning prior to them starting the activities, the assessment activities.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So have you gotten interesting responses like from working professionals and stuff?
If you get maybe an assignment from 2 people, I'm almost assume you're getting assigned. People don't really respond. They don't respond. I think a lot of times they appreciate it, but they simply don't respond to it. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I guess maybe if anything, the grades are good. So I suppose they're responding that way.
That's one way they can respond. Cool.
Galen, I'm going to chime in on that and kind of give you my response. My preferred teaching method would be experiential learning for students. Whenever you can position the students or give them an opportunity to apply some of the course concepts in a real world setting, I find that to be very effective.
That's great. And
have you found, Galen, that going back to your networking, recognition, strategic, and effective, have you found, which I have, that on the strategic, a noticeable number of students will not use a flow chart to learn the class. It's just the reverse. After they're done with a certain procedure, what they'll do is then construct a flow chart for the future. But when they start out, it's pretty much not a helter-skelter. I won't say that, but they go through, they practice, they make mistakes, they correct the mistakes, they go back to the right way. But then when they're all done, then they form their flow chart rather than forming the flow chart at the beginning.
Yes, I have observed that, and for what it's worth, I've experienced the same thing personally. I found flow charts to be an effective tool for kind of summarizing existing sort of notes rather than a starting point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I have noticed that. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to move on. I did want to mention a few things specifically about veterans. Because they are kind of their own class of adult learners. And obviously these are older learners, so andragogy applies. And you may not have had an abundance of them. I'm just curious, have either of you had vets in your class or any of your classes?
Yeah, we sure do.
Okay. Yeah, just curious. But obviously there's just a few things to be aware of. We did a little bit of research recently on this. Learning House did. So in terms of the profile of a typical veteran, veterans often have trouble adjusting to civilian life, obviously depending on how long they've served. And online ed naturally involves a sense of isolation. Students are at home or wherever, not with their other students. But veterans often struggle with this sense of isolation more than other older learners, as you might imagine. And oftentimes these veterans, have mental or physical struggles. And I think there's a 2011 study found that 24% of student veterans suffered from severe depression, 35% suffered from severe anxiety, 36% suffered from symptoms of PTSD, and 46% suffered from suicidal thoughts. So, many of these students may not even, they might not disclose this to you. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily feel close enough to you to do that, but maybe they don't even have a diagnosis at this point, right? They don't even know they have a diagnosable disease or something. So for what it's worth, try to make sure that your syllabus includes your office hours and really explicit invitations to contact you if you have any questions, and frequently encourage students to get in touch with you about any concerns in the course at all. This obviously helps everyone, but especially veterans. Whatever you can do to make that environment welcoming to students will help those veterans. Some specific strategies for veterans if they're in your course is to, first of all, identify them. You don't want to do this intrusively, obviously, or publicly. You don't want to call them out or try to call them out. But you can ask this question in your prior knowledge assessment, for example, because presumably these would be private, privately submitted, or included as a suggestion in your icebreaker activity if people are willing to share that information, or included as a recommendation, like I said, in your syllabus. If you're a veteran, let me know. Another tip may be obvious, but be aware of your the on-campus services or digital service or virtual services that your institution has. So I don't know, Donnie, do you know if SAU has a Veterans Resource Center of some sort?
None that I'm aware of, but
well, we got a guy though that's has high. Haven't we a guy that was hired that had
I don't know. We may have to get back to you on that one, Galen.
No, I mean, I was just curious.
Not my area of expertise, but I want to say we have a contact person here somewhere.
We do. Okay, great. I was just curious. There's no need to get back to me unless you want to, but there's evidence that shows that the presence of such a center can lead to greater graduation rates and greater participation levels for those vets. So it's really an invaluable resource. But not just the Veterans Resource Center, but just to be aware of tutoring and disability services on that SAU offers as well, because many of these veterans disrupted their formal education to serve, so they might need some help acclimating back to academic work and writing, on top of coping with physical or cognitive difficulties. So again, for what it's worth, include that information in your syllabus. Also, be mindful of asking your students to share their experience when there are veterans in your class. They may be sensitive discussing it with you and their classmates, so definitely don't put them on the spot in the discussion boards or anything like that. As much as you want to address students individually or encourage particular students to respond if you know things about them, oh, so-and-so might be able to provide an interesting answer to this. You don't want to put someone on the spot necessarily just because they're a veteran. And 2 points that may go without saying: try to avoid saying that you can understand or you can relate if you haven't served in the military. That can be particularly offensive to a lot of vets. And again, may go without saying, never allow your students to ask if a student has killed someone. I mean, that can happen, and it's terrible. You don't want to judge up those kind of things. Also, this is kind of interesting, but ensure that these student vets know that they can disagree with you and that this is part of, civil academic discourse, right? Many veterans feel or might feel hesitant to disagree with you because of the sort of structure that they had in the military, which is obviously based on rank and hierarchy, and these are strictly adhered to, where they can't disagree with their commanding officer and stuff. And lastly, just pay close attention to discussions that stray into the realm of politics or the military. Now, I should say, political discussions, they could be some of the best discussions out there, provided they stay civil, because students have strong opinions about them and they're more prepared in many ways to back up their arguments with evidence. But you want to try to make sure that no one gives unintentional offense. So for example, if the Iraq War comes up, many people, have strong opinions about the Iraq War. But if someone says, if someone starts talking about, the WMD's thing was a weak argument, we were in Iraq illegally or whatever, that might be interpreted as a slight to their sacrifice or the sacrifices of their comrades. So again, I don't think you need to necessarily completely adjust your teaching strategy if you've got a veteran in your class. I think you just kind of need to be more just sensitive to the fact that there's someone who may be coping with difficulty, who may have PTSD, and at least according to these metrics that I talked about, half of them might be thinking about suicide, which is just kind of terrifying, but what can you do, right? So some of the big takeaways from today, Andragogy is a teaching methodology focused on adult learners. Probably knew that coming in. Adult learners tend to learn differently than their younger counterparts. They're more self-directed, they're more motivated, and so on. UDL, Universal Design for Learning, provides a useful course design framework for addressing all of your students, meeting them where they are, regardless of age or their learning preferences. And lastly, just like we talked about, veterans may require more specific approaches. This is just a sign-in form for people who arrive late, but don't worry about it. If there are any questions or discussion, I'd be delighted to hear them.
Yeah, you could check if you see Jessica or Megan, okay? Because I'm going to add that icebreaker to the master course, but I'm going to give them some point value on that. That will be their first quiz.
Great.
And I think I'm going to add that to the master for STBE 137 and the master for MBA 600. Okay, that will be their first assignment. That should be able to might give me a clue as to the military aspect.
Yeah.
I don't think I want to go in there and ask them, but I want to know it. Okay.
Got it. If they have any military affiliation, they'll disclose in that icebreaker conversation.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. I think so too.
Galen, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here. We have a couple of students waiting apparently for an evening class. So with that said, I want to say thank you very much.
Thanks, Galen.
To our host, Galen Davis here. He did a really great job on the presentation and presenting some of the many aspects of Andragogy. If we can get into it even further, if anyone watching this stream has any additional questions, please email me or Galen Davis. His email address is listed on the screen. I will be sending out a notification as to when our next workshop will be offered. Should be here within the next 2 months. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and close things out. Galen, thank you again, and thank you to our capacity crowd here.
Well, thanks to you too.
So we're going to go ahead and close things out. Thanks, everybody.
It was my pleasure.